please show us how Professor Setter's pronunciation is different from Professor Wells's, with some examples. Because Professor Setter told us in room 501 that she speaks, well, it says estuary English.
Estuary.
I think it must be estuary
No, I actually
English.
said I thought that you would say that I spoke estuary English.
I wouldn't be so rude. It's a serious question. It's also a silly question. And we did consider answering it by telling you just don't be so stupid. For all practical purposes, our pronunciation is identical. On the other hand, Jane is much younger than me, so it's no surprise at all if my pronunciation is in some respects conservative compared with hers, and that is the case. We can see various examples of that. We talked about the ur diphthong and words like sure becoming sure. Now, Jane, you, I think, would normally say sure.
Sure.
If you ask me what I
Sure.
say, I'll probably tell you I say sure. But if you listen carefully and catch me unawares, half of the time you'll notice I say sure. And I know that from having studied tapes of myself talking. So I don't necessarily have the ability to report accurately on my own speech. Nobody does. I represent an earlier generation, halfway between sure and sure, which means that sometimes I go one way, sometimes I go the other. My father, or certainly my grandfather, would consistently say sure. The next generation consistently says sure. And that's exactly then what we will predict, and that is a difference between our pronunciations. Similarly, there's this question of the glottal stop gradually coming in various syllable final environments. Now, I certainly do use glottal stops in words like football, atmosphere, but Jane uses somewhat more of them than I do, and that too reflects our pronunciation. A moment ago, when we were talking privately, she used the expression "it has to," but she pronounced it "it has to" with a glottal stop. It has to. Now, I don't use glottal stop before H. I do before various other consonants, but not before H. She represents the next stage, which quite logically treats H as a consonant and extends this process just one little bit further so that it comes in phrases like "it has to." Do you want to add anything to that?
I'd just like to add a slight warning, if you like. Although I do say sure, there are some places where I do have an ur. This tends to be after a y sound. So I wouldn't say pure, for example, I'd say pure. So again, it's a kind of a gradual thing. I do know people who say pure, but I'm not one of them. So it's interesting. If you actually listen to the way people speak, you can hear lots of differences in the way people speak, even though they actually sound rather similar on the surface of it. I'm trying to think of another example.
Well, I'll give you some, because it's very difficult actually to study these sound changes when they are still in progress. It would be much better if we could come back in 200 years and we'd know then what the final end point was going to be.
Good heavens, did they end up saying that? No.
At the moment, we're just really not sure. You see, I did this in my survey. I asked people about the word jury, J-U-R-Y, 12 citizens to decide in a court. And I said I couldn't use technical terms, I didn't want to use phonetic symbols, so I said, does it rhyme with story, jory, which is one possibility. Then I said, does it rhyme with furry, furry animals, animals with fur, so jury. Or does it rhyme with neither of those? And if it's jury, still, then clearly it rhymes with neither of them. A big majority voted for rhymes with neither of them. There were votes for all three possibilities, and actually jury came out slightly ahead of jory. But the majority said neither of them. Of course, we don't really know what they meant by neither. They could be saying things like jury, which is a sort of long ooh. And how do we phonemicize that? Do we really have an ur in the system still? All the evidence is that ur is disappearing from the system. But perhaps what it's leaving behind is that oo thing, which is then an allophone of oo. Just the special kind of oo that you use before r. So jury. And it'll then come in purity and jury and various other words like that, and might indeed influence pure that you were speaking of, because pure and purity would be likely to behave the same. Furious, curious, not necessarily furious and curious, although there are people who say that. I'm not sure where that sound change is going.
Now you're saying sure.
Is that what I said? Good! That's what I said. I wasn't thinking about it. Okay.
I think you will differ from each other by saying there.
Ah, yes. That was the other thing I was trying to think about. The diphthong air. We were talking about Mary, and in some American accents, Mary, Merry, and marry are the same, or Mary, Mary, Mary. They're like this. But for me, I don't have an air. I don't have the air diphthong. I have air. I have a long air. Yes, and that's another younger.
And do you have that particularly before R, or do you have it in final position as well? Would you say square?
Yes, I'd say square.
Okay, yes, that's true. And somebody asked me about that. I think it was Professor Shimaoka, and I asked him what he'd heard me saying, and he said I was saying air. And I believe that I do normally say air with a diphthong, but obviously I know that lots of people use a monophthong air. I would say that I most readily use air, if at all, before R and another vowel. So Mary is not too bad for me, but square seems pretty odd. And fair and square, no, fair and square. The first one is happier, fair and square, because it's got an R and something else after it. Again, it clearly doesn't matter. These are these very subtle allophonic realizational differences, which of course do add up to an impression, but are not very great in the whole scheme of things. I think also I use rather more syllabic consonants than Jane does. I noticed her earlier using the word which she pronounced pattern, which I would normally say as pattern, for what it's worth. But, you know, these are very subtle differences, nothing very big at all. Well, don't forget, Jane does come from the southeast of England. I come from the north of England. So we originate 200, 250 miles apart, which is, as you know, quite a difference, quite a distance for there to be different local accents. But of course, received pronunciation in the ideal is not localizable within England. So to the extent that you can't recognize us as southeastern or northern respectively, perhaps we're succeeding in speaking RP, I don't know.
Actually, I think one of the things that annoys me about phonetics, one of the things that annoys me about phonetics is when other phoneticians say, "Ha! You've got a diphthong in there." But hey, I do that too, so I can't be annoyed.
I think we all like doing that. Yeah. Yes, if you get bored with listening to what somebody's saying, listen to how they say it, and that'll be fascinating.
Going back to A and air.
Yes.
Is that why we often use the cardinal vowel A for the air sound?
Well,
I mean, when you transcribe.
I'm not sure that it is the reason. Daniel Jones, from what he says, implies that the air diphthong tended to have a rather opener starting point than A and the short vowel E. And indeed there are some speakers for whom it sounds like the AE digraph, ah. That's now rather archaic. People don't say share things anymore, they say share or indeed share. So maybe that's where that notation comes from, but it is handy that it means if we want to show long air as a monophthong, we can use a cardinal 3 symbol and a length mark. We get into complications if we use the cardinal 2 symbol with a length mark. Shared and shed then become a length-only minimal pair. I shared my food and put it in the shed. Shared, shed. Yes.
The pronunciation of diphthongs always attracts me. So I have a feeling that the diphthongs are really very unstable. In the Old English, there were 3 diphthongs, but they all smooth or monophthongized. And in the Middle English, I think the new diphthongs were created. So they, considering from the fact that the pronunciation changes from the schwa to show or schwa to to, what the pronunciation will be in the future? I mean, the diphthongization occur again? I mean, the breaking or diphthongization occur?
Well, in the very long term, yes, presumably. The trouble about historical linguistics in general is we don't have a theory of it that is watertight. If we had a real theory of language change, in the scientific sense, we would be able to predict the future. But clearly we can't do that with confidence. So to that extent we haven't got a satisfactory theory of language change. Nevertheless, in English, it is very instructive to compare what happens in received pronunciation on the one hand with what happens in Australian English on the other hand. Because in many respects, Australian English seems to be sort of like English with the brakes taken off, where they are not held back in the way we are in our rather prim English way, but they go out into the wide open spaces and cast off all restraints. And of course the Australians have monophthongized. They say not beer to drink, but beer. And they don't say square, they indeed say square. They don't say poor, they say poor if they're not going to have poor, which they can also have. So that does certainly suggest that monophthongs are the first target. Once, of course, you've got a monophthong, then it can enter into all the various vowel shifts that have gone on in English throughout history. The most striking one, of course, in Australia as in London, is then the vowel shift that changes A into I, changes I into oi, and changes oi into oi. So this ends up being my toy rather than my tie. And I would imagine that that is likely to become standard in Britain within the next 200 or 300 years. But we're not going to be here to see whether I'm right or wrong.